Jake, do Scientologists discuss ways to beat the machine, i.e. the e-meter, when discussing security checking and such? Is there passed down lore about how to make the needle float, like hand lotions, or how to squeeze or not squeeze the cans, or drink a lot of water the day of security checks to allow energy to flow smoothly by decreasing your body's resistance, so they will miss that overt and withhold from past life when you were a snail? Thanks for the question, Jake. And here's the thing. The first thing I want to talk about is the general attitude that Scientologists have about the e-meter. And this is really important in the same way that it's important to understand, when you get asked questions like, how do people stay in this for so long and how do they get into it in the first place? It has to do a lot with attitude. And because when you're looking at Scientology from a skeptical, critical point of view, or from an objective outsider point of view, you're not looking at it the same way as people who are in it are looking at it, okay? So very few people who are in the world of Scientology are trying to beat the e-meter because they believe in its efficacy and they believe that it's there to help them, and they believe that Scientology is something that's there to help, not to invade, not to hurt them, not to destroy their privacy or something like that. That is what Scientology is doing, but don't get me wrong. But that's not how they're approaching it. Right? When they're still a Scientologist and they're still in that mindset, then they tend to believe in and go with the flow of what's happening. There was a story that L. Ron Hubbard actually himself told, which I'll relate to you. It was at an event, and Hubbard didn't tell it. A guy who knew Hubbard told it, and it was somebody who had met Hubbard, kind of a rough character actually, who I don't remember his connection with St. Hill in England, but he was sort of a, kind of a criminal type of guy. And he, self-admittedly, and he met Hubbard, and Hubbard took him into his office one day. He just invited him in. I guess the guy was out doing work on the cars or something. And he showed the guy the e-meter. And he said, here's the e-meter, and he was telling him a little bit about it. And the story, as the guy related it, was he said he looked at the meter and he was like, oh, I could beat that. And Hubbard kind of looked at him and said, okay, but it's not there to be beaten. It's there to help you. And that was actually a pretty good response in the context of Scientology and dealing with that, that skepticism. In other words, because you have that attitude and because you also buy into the idea that the meter works 100% of the time and can peer into your soul and responds on things that you are not even totally fully aware of yet when it's responding, that you have to be guided and directed to get the answers. Your attitude about the e-meter is that it's there in the room to assist the auditor to help you. Okay, so that being totally crystal clear, you very rarely get people in the world of Scientology who are trying to beat the meter. However, it does happen. And when it does, and it comes out that that's what the person was doing, they get in all kinds of trouble. Because it's basically looked at as being, actively dishonest, and which is, in the world of Scientology, is tantamount to being a criminal. Because of this idea that it's there to help, right? And so you're looked on as someone who is actively sabotaging your own spiritual freedom, right? So it's it's a whole wrong attitude thing, and you get in a lot of ethics trouble for that. But yes, there are ways to use one's body to get the meter to do things, and I'll tell you two examples of this. One is the floating needle, which indicates that the needle on the e-meter does this kind of a motion. The definition of it is a rhythmic sweep of the dial at a slow, even pace of the needle, back and forth, without change in speed. Particularly, right? And that's almost verbatim. And so this floating needle is supposed to indicate the end, that you've reached the end result of whatever action or process you're doing, and that you're supposed to be in pretty good spirits when an FN appears. So a way to produce an FN artificially is to rub your bare feet on the carpet or on the floor. Now you can hear when somebody's doing that. you know, if they're not doing it quietly. But if they have socks on or something, it's a little harder to hear, especially on a carpeted floor. And I've seen people do that, and the needle starts doing this kind of a motion. And if they have to move the feet real gently, real slow. This is not a, you know, this kind of a motion. You can see that immediately. Auditors are trained when they're trained on using the e-meter, there's a whole drill about recognizing body reactions, that when the person's lifting a finger off the cans or squeezing the cans or doing something, rubbing the can against a garment or against their skin or something, that these produce noticeable reactions that are different, very different from emotional, mental responses that you see on a meter. So auditors are trained to look for and ignore body reactions. So the person who's faking it has to be really smooth, and you know, they'd have to like move their feet very, very subtly. But you could do that, and you could get somebody who thinks that that's a floating needle. Especially one of the things about reading an e-meter, and this will be, you know, something I cover in more detail when I finally get that meter video done, is a lot of reading a meter has to do with confirmation bias and has to do with what the auditor is expecting to see. So if the person is sitting there going, wow, I feel great, and I had this wonderful win, and and I'm just like out of my head right now, and I think I'm exterior, you know, having an out-of-body experience, they'll be watching the needle expecting to see a floating needle. So they could read into whatever they're looking at and expecting to see this thing, and they'll interpret the meter reading accordingly. Okay, another example, and just to end off on this question, but to give you another interesting example that's come up a couple times, where a person wanted to get out of the Sea Org. They wanted to get out of their job. They hated it. They didn't like the pressure. They didn't like what was happening. And so they got on a meter one day in an interview, in an ethics interview, and they faked with can squeezing and touching the cans together, which produces an electric shock of the needle that does this kind of a thing. They produce what's called a rock slam, which is supposed to indicate a hidden evil intention on the subject being talked about or looked at. So in this case, the guy was rambling on about whatever he was rambling on about, but he was under the desk squeezing the cans and touching them together, causing the needle to do this kind of a crazy motion, which is what a rock slam is supposed to be. So the person who was at the other end of the meter was like, "Ooh, rock slam, R/S," right? Wrote down everything the guy was saying. And it kind of backfired on the person because he ended up doing the RPF. And then it kind of all came out that he had faked it, but he was stuck on the RPF. So, you know, that wasn't so great for him. I think eventually he ended up leaving the Sea Org through the RPF. So anyway, so yes, it can be done, but no, Scientologists do not sit around talking to each other about how to beat an e-meter. That would be one of the most severely horrible things that Scientologists would consider doing, and they would never talk about that amongst themselves.